We are in Acts chapter 16, and I forgot to flip the map, so let me do that very quickly. We want no filter, and we want to flip the horizontal flip. There we go. Okay. Great. Okay, that's perfect. Okay, good. So, I think we're good to go. Okay, so we are in Acts chapter 16, and we are looking at, if you can remember, that we have been talking in Acts about Paul's missionary journey. And here I brought you a picture of a terrible collision. You can see the little pink car has collided with the red car, and the look on my grandson's face says it all. What are you doing with your vehicle? Hers has a propeller, by the way. His just has fun noises on it. So they have a good time together. So beside that beautiful picture is a map of Paul's missionary journey. And I mentioned to you that it would be good for you to learn to look at and use the tools in your own Bible, just so that you begin to familiarize yourself with these different places. What will happen is, as you begin to kind of hear the names of those places and think about the missionary journeys that occurred, you'll be more adept at remembering what occurred in the scripture. And we're going to start, you notice we've not left Acts yet, but we're going to leave Acts. We're going to leave. So the thing is, on the first missionary journey, he went around the first time with Barnabas, right? And remember, we looked on our map. When he went there, they went over here to Cyprus, where Barnabas was from. They got letters of introduction. And then they went up here to Italia, Perga. And then they went up to the other Antioch. Remember, there's two different Antiochs. There's actually more than two, but there's one over here and there's one over here. They went up to this Antioch and then Philomeum place, that place. And they went over to Iconium and Lystra and Derbe. Remember, in Lystra was, no, they didn't, yeah. Remember, Lystra was where he was stoned, where Paul was stoned. And so then once they got to Derbe, they turned around and came back that same way and came back home, okay? So today we're going to talk about the second missionary journey that starts in Acts chapter 16. And so on the second missionary journey, remember that Paul and Barnabas had agreed, along with the members of the church of Antioch, that it was time to go back and revisit the churches that they had gone to before. But a little argument came up. Does anybody remember the argument that came up? Mark. It was about Mark. They had trouble with Mark. Now, what was the problem with Mark? Well, that's what we think, right? We kind of think that he was too young when he went on the first trip, because as soon as they ended up having some trouble, he left. When on the first missionary trip, Mark was with them. We think that Mark was very young at that time, maybe in his late teens, early 20s. Now, Mark was around at the time of Christ, but we think at the time of Christ, when Mark is around, he was probably like 11 or 12. And the reason we think that is because in the Gospel of Mark, written by Mark, in that Gospel, there is an event that is only told in Mark. Does anybody remember what event is only told in Mark? It's the one where when Christ was taken, a young man's cloak got torn away from him, and he had to run home naked. Remember that? So who knows about that? The young man that had to run home naked, Mark. Yeah, they think that's something you would remember, right? And because of the term young man, they believe Mark was probably like 12, 11, 10, 11, 12, like in that range. That would be considered age of accountability, but still a very young man. So by the time they're going on that first missionary journey, he was in his late teens. And basically, they came to some hardship in the first part of that missionary journey, and he went home. He went back. So many scholars, many people believe that Mark was just too young that first missionary journey. He wasn't ready to go on that. Another philosophy that's coming out that I'm reading in the different commentators is they also believe that Timothy and Mark were probably about the same age. And they believe that Timothy and Mark were probably very opposite in terms of how they matured. In other words, Timothy flourished under the guidance of Paul. Mark flourished under the guidance of Barnabas. What's the difference between Paul and Barnabas?
Barnabas was gentler. He would resolve situations where there was conflict.
Yeah, when's the last time we heard of Barnabas getting stoned? Who got stoned? Paul. Paul got stoned.
Barnabas was a peacemaker.
Peacemaker, encourager. He was the encourager.
He was less intense.
Yes. Whenever there was a difficult situation that they needed some resolution about, who'd they send? Barnabas. Whenever they needed things to calm down and quit being so hostile, who'd they get rid of? Paul. Paul got sent home because there was so much persecution in Jerusalem after his preaching. Now, was he a poor preacher?
No.
Actually, he was too good.
Yeah.
He made his point very well and very clearly. And that's Paul becomes the one who understands the idea of not causing a problem unless you have to cause a problem, because the message itself creates enough of a problem. There's no use in creating more trouble over something else that doesn't matter. Paul becomes that kind of minister. He really gets that. Of course, he's willing to go all the way to being stoned and run out of town and beat up and flogged. He's willing to do that, but he doesn't ask for it. He tries to make his way in so that he can get the message in. But his point is that the message itself is a difficult message for some to receive. Now, Barnabas, he's more politically correct. He tends to follow it along better, say it more politely, be less abrasive about what he's having to say. So which is better?
They both have their purpose.
We said last week, all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to their purpose. So God uses Paul to do what only Paul can do. And God uses Barnabas to do only what Barnabas can do. And sometimes Paul and Barnabas can't be together and do what they need to do. So Barnabas disappears after chapter Acts 15. We no longer see anything about Barnabas. Some people think that Barnabas was 10 years or more older than Paul. And some think that perhaps he went home and then stayed there, probably maybe because he was aged and he needed to reduce his moving around so much. We don't really know. That's all conjecture. We have no idea. So when you get to heaven and you're sitting out on the porch with Barnabas, you can say, hey, whatever happened after that little spat you had with Paul, right? Now, Paul went on to wreak havoc in other places. And in Acts 16, we're going to hear about some of the events that occurred then once he and Barnabas went their separate ways. So we are in Acts chapter 16. Keith, look who's here today. Keith, look who's here. Judy's here today. So we are in Acts chapter 16. I know I saw Judy and I looked at her and I go, oh, hi, and I go, Judy, wait, what's Judy doing?
You just get lucky some days.
I know, we do. Some days we get lucky. Thank you so much for being back. Oh, and look, aren't I good? See what I brought today? I brought my little readers. So, see, comma?
There's a place over here.
You know. Okay, we're in chapter 16, and we have some people watching. My brother-in-law, David Hahn, is watching. Praise God, he got a job recently with Habitat for Humanity. He's been looking for a long time for a job, so yay, David. And Deanne Reinhardt is watching, and Linda Williamson. It's good to see you guys. Glad you could join us. Okay, we're in Acts chapter 16. He came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where disciple named
Timothy.
Aha! He bailed Mark with Barnabas. So Mark and Barnabas go to on to, what's the name of the island? Cyprus, right? And then he goes on to Lystra, which is the backwards way. So they went from where they were, where is it at? It's somewhere over here. They went across, here it is. They were at Antioch over here, and Barnabas and Mark went to Cyprus. So which way did Paul go?
North.
North, the opposite way. But look where he's going. He hits his hometown of Tarsus, And then he goes up here to Lystra, Iconium, Antioch. Those are the places they visited on their first trip. So on the second trip, he's going backwards up that way. And look who he runs into. Now, why did he run into Timothy?
Timothy lived there.
That's right, because whose mother was a Jewess and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. Now, if you had a mother who was Jewish, would she want to have you circumcised?
Yeah.
She would. But if your father was Greek, would he want to have you circumcised?
No.
I'll tell you that the Greeks thought of circumcision as mutilation. And they were against any form of mutilation like that. And they would have, I say the term mutilation because they spoke of it in very harsh terms. It was barbaric. It was considered very uncouth to do such a thing. And so the mother, because the mother was Jewess, a Jewess, that meant that Timothy was Jewish. But to not be circumcised, that's going to set him apart from the other Jews, right? So the father, being Greek, didn't allow him to have been circumcised. So let's take a look at verse 2. The brothers at Lystra and Iconium. So they're up here in Lystra and Iconium, this area. The brothers that were there spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey. So he... Wait a minute. Didn't we just read a few chapters back? I mean, not that long ago. Wasn't Paul a part of the delegation that went and said, you don't have to be circumcised?
Right.
And here's Paul himself doing this circumcision. In the Jewish culture, who would have done the circumcision? The priest or the father? Paul does the circumcision. Paul becomes kind of a father figure for Timothy. How do we know that? Because we have two letters from Paul to Timothy, and that's what's expressed in those letters, in 1st and 2nd, kind of feeling that Paul kind of brings him up in the faith. Okay, but why is Paul doing circumcision? I thought we just had this big deal about the delegation going there and back and blah, 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 and this letter from James ruling that, the 4 things, right? Remember all that? So why is he doing circumcision? It says here, as they traveled in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. Oh, back to this, verse 3. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. What is Paul's missionary plan? What does he do everywhere he goes? He goes first to the Jews, to the temple. How is he going to bring Timothy in to be working alongside of him and ministering if he's not been circumcised? There would always be that debate. Oh, his mother's a Jew, but his father's not, and he hasn't been circumcised. That would be the topic. Does Paul want circumcision to be the topic?
No, so it was to remove the stigma.
To remove the whole discussion. Do we have to have that discussion again? When Paul got the decision from James about the 4 things, that was the whole point of that. To quit talking about circumcision with the Greeks. Let's talk to them about Christ and how Christ is going to save them from themselves. Let's talk about the salvation, the things that matter. The circumcision doesn't matter. I imagine Paul going, I am up to here with circumcision. It doesn't matter. I could see him feeling that way. Yes, Bob.
I know this is kind of a stray question, but who's supposed to know they were circumcised or not?
Yeah, they check it at the door or what?
Okay. Okay, now you're telling me that when you're standing around in the urinal, you never get a glimpse.
Oh, yeah, but I mean, people don't gather around here.
And once you know, you know. Once you know, you know. And this mark was a specific mark for being a Jew. So the rumor would fly. It would be all about the rumors. Well, we were at the bathhouse the other day, and I happen to know he never has been, and he's, 18 years old, and he's never had. So it became a thing. And you're right. Probably someone could figure out a way to hide it, I guess. But you'd have to be. I'm just saying, you men are like that.
And when you're running around the desert out there traveling from open spaces, everybody.
You whoop it out and you take care of business. And when you whoop it out, there's other people whooping theirs out and you just happen to notice. Nobody acts like they notice. I know you pretend, that you're looking away.
One thing, I wouldn't want it to have been a little boy at that time.
That would be pretty hard, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't have wanted to have been 19 when Paul did it either. Would you? No. Now, the Greeks considered it mutilation. And so the thing is that Paul's message, he takes first to the Jews. So that was the point of making sure Timothy wasn't going to be a stumbling block for ministering to the Jews. Now, this was not something Paul forced on Timothy, right? It sounds like Timothy kind of wanted to have this done because it kind of clarifies that he is Jewish. The mother being Jewish, I guess that takes care of it in their culture. But the father being Greek, everyone knew the father would be opposed to that. So I don't know if we need that map again. I'll do it just in case. Okay. So so then they take care of that. And it also, notice that it says they all knew that his father was Greek. So Bob, that's another thing. Everyone knew that his father was Greek. So his father probably had made some statements about, well, I'm not getting my son circumcised, that mutilation. So it sounds like it was a part of that too, to make the point with people who already knew him. Okay, so starting at verse 6 then. Paul and his companions. So who are his companions now? Timothy and Silas. So Paul, Timothy, Silas. Notice the pronouns here. Paul and his companions. Who's writing this book? Luke. So is Luke with them in verse 6?
I don't know.
It doesn't say.
It doesn't say. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. So, see, I should have made it go. Wake up, wake up. Time to wake up. Wake up. Okay, so here they come up here. They visit Derbe, Lystra, Iconium. They pick up Timothy. I don't know whether it's 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy, but one of the Timothys they pick up. And they go up here to this area. And it says they're prevented from going into Asia. Asia would have been done this way. They continued up towards this way. And you say, well, how did the Spirit prevent them from going up? Well, let's keep reading. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. Now, Troas is over here. So they went up this way, and then they came here. And we keep this term, the Spirit led them or told them, or the Spirit of Jesus. Okay, so what is that like, A crystal ball, and all of a sudden a face appears. How does that happen? Let's see. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, what's the next two-letter word? Wait a minute. Who's we then? Bum, 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 bum. From this point through the rest of the book, it's always we, us, our. The pronouns change. Guess where Paul lives? Right here in Troas. What's Paul's profession?
Doctor.
He's a doctor. Many scholars believe that Paul began to have his problem. They believe it's with his eyes, some sort of problem. And when it says here the Spirit prevented him from going here and prevented him from going there, they believed that he was seeking medical treatment for his eyes, that he was having trouble traveling, having trouble trying to go to places where he could get help with his eyes. There are a few other clues in various scriptures that lead to that, but basically that's the idea that most of the scholars believed. And Dr. Luke lived in Troas, and they believed that this area had a very booming medical practice where they had many kinds of treatments they used for various illnesses. And that in that day, that's what you would do if you had a serious illness. You would go to where the doctors or the remedies were at. And so many people believe that that's why Paul says the Spirit led, or that they're going this direction. He has this vision of going to Macedonia, and so he's going to get help. And he picks up Dr. Luke in Troas. From then on, Dr. Luke travels with Paul through the entire of his rest of his ministry. All of his travels, and everywhere he goes, Luke is with him. Fern?
I never thought about it being his eyes before, but some of the letters he wrote, he had somebody else write for him.
In the one letter that he wrote himself, he said, "You can see I'm writing this with my own hand because the print is so large."
Yeah.
So many people think that the day that he was blinded on the road to Damascus, that from that day forward he had vision problems, that he could not see well, and he had problems with his eyes. Some say that they get infected or pussy, or that they just caused him headaches or discomfort. There have been different things. Other people say, well, if you've got bad eyes, plus you keep getting stoned and beat up, that'll do you in too. So I don't know. If you get stoned to the point that people think you're dead, it probably affects your head and your eyes and your brain. So he probably had a lot of different physical ailments from the different traumas that he had gone through. But what we do know is that from this point on the second missionary journey, from this place in Troas, from then on, Dr. Luke is with him. Dr. Luke writes many of the books that he does, and that letters, writes them out for him, is like scribes for him. And also, Luke keeps this record. So from here on, Luke is with Paul. So Luke, we read, Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, and Luke wrote Acts, and then Luke was the scribe for Paul in many of the other books. When Luke writes the Gospel, where is he getting his information from? Paul. And all of the other people that Luke is seeing all along the way. He ends up meeting all those apostles and people every time they gather, because he is now with Paul to the end of Paul's life. And so he's in it. He's in the mix of everything that's going on. He was a very learned man, a very skilled writer, and he basically takes care of Paul now. So that all these times that he gets injured and he's in prison and whatever, Dr. Luke is making sure that he has food and has care. In fact, I had a really cool scripture. Would someone mind looking at 2 Timothy 4:9? Does anybody mind looking that up so I don't have to turn my page? Vern's going to get it.
4:9. Do your best to come to me quickly. For Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica. Crescens
Keep going. Yeah, that's good. You can say it.
has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you.
That's
because
good right
he is
there.
helpful to me.
Okay, so at the end of his life, they believe that Paul was martyred in 68 AD, and they think that was written and that he never got released from there. That was from when he died from there, was martyred. So at the end of his life, Luke is with him, and who's the last person he sends to come?
Mark. Get Mark and bring him with you
Yeah.
because he's helpful to me in my ministry.
Why would Paul make sure to bring Mark back in?
He must know the end is.
He knows the end is near, and he also knows that Mark has a ministry. Mark did well. He spent time with Barnabas, and he became a good, helpful minister. He became a good apostle and did all the things he should do. Paul is making sure to tie up that loose end.
He was second generation.
So no one thinks that Mark was less than because Paul didn't want to take him on that second missionary journey. Can you see how that would look? People might think somehow there was something wrong with Mark. And Paul's goal, he's totally focused on his ministry and getting the message of Christ out. So he makes sure that that loose end is not left, right? That there's no loose end there. Make sure people know that there's nothing wrong with Mark. That Mark is useful to him and helpful to him. Yes.
Didn't Mark spend time with Peter too?
We believe so. Yes.
So Barnabas rubbed off on
I think Paul is always focused on ministry, and I doubt he ever had anything against Mark, except that he needed someone who could help.
Yeah, some people are really work oriented.
Yeah, I think that would be Paul. Barnabas, though, would be more concerned, I would think, about the people part of it, the relationship part. But who said? Oh yeah, go ahead.
But Paul was trying to tie up all the loose ends, bring the scrolls, like Mark for them.
Okay.
As far as the scrolls.
So, do we do that? Like, if we had a break in relationship or something going on with someone, and we knew we were coming to a transition or a time, do we do that? Do we call them in and make sure they know that it's nothing personal? Right? I think we all do that with our children, with the people we know, when we're trying to make a point that I don't have anything against this person. Make this relationship is right. Things are okay here. There's no barrier between us.
Yeah, if we don't, we should.
Yeah, if we don't, we should. And do we know when our last day is? No, we don't. So I would encourage all of us to do it now. As much as it is on our part, make sure we've made all those communications now. Now, of course, other people have other ideas, and they may not want to talk to you. But the point is, don't be thinking you're going to do it later, because later may not come. In Paul's case, it did not come. Later did not come. If you want to look at the eyes, if you look at Galatians 4:12, I think there's a verse about that, 4:12. And let's see, Vern, would you mind looking at 4:12? And would someone else look up 6:11?
What?
Galatians 4:12. And someone, would you look at Galatians 6:11? Who could do 6:11?
I got it.
You got it? Okay. You got 4:12, Vern?
Not yet. Yes, I do.
Okay, what's it say there in 4:12?
4:12 says, I plead with you, brothers, become like me, for I became like you. You have done me no wrong. As you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you.
Aha! And that Galatia is over here. That's where he was going from. So that's like saying that was because of an illness that got him over into that second missionary journey where he ended up speaking to the Galatians. So that's the little tip. That's one place they use.
So he was going to the doctor, huh?
That's what people believe, and that they believe that Dr. Luke ended up being his physician and scribe and kind of a follower. So 6:11, who has Galatians 6:11? Bob, Don does?
See what large letters I use as I write to you with my own hand.
Okay. So in other words, if he's going to write it himself, it's going to be in big letters. And that would indicate a vision issue, right? I doubt he had trouble forming the letters. It's that he can't see, and so he's writing large. So those are the little hints. Now, is that absolute? I wouldn't spend 5 minutes arguing that with somebody. That's just the little tips that are there, and it does add a little color and flavor to the story. And so it kind of helps you to remember the story. What is the story of Paul? That nothing gets in the way of the gospel. He makes sure to get everything out of the way of spreading the gospel. That would be his mission. And now he has a little crew that's going with him. So who's in his crew now? Luke? Mark? Well, Mark went with Barnabas. And that when Mark returns, that's at the end when he dies. So right now, second missionary journey, you've got Timothy, Silas, Dr. Luke, and Paul. From Troas on, that's who you have through the rest of the journey. Luke ends up staying with them to the end of his life. And at the end of his life, he calls Mark back to him. So Luke and Mark end up being the ones that are with him at the end of his life. I think that's kind of interesting. Okay, so let's go on to chapter 16, verse 13. Wait a minute. Did I not?
11.
11. Okay, let me make sure. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you very much. So we are in chapter 16, starting at verse, I'm going to start at 10, because we got stuck on the pronoun we. All of that talking was because it said we right there. Sorry. Okay, verse 10. After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight to Samothrace, and the next day on to Neapolis. From there, we traveled to, what's the name? Philippi. That's the Philippians. Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. We stayed there for several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside to the city gate to the river. Wait a minute. Where does Paul like to go?
Synagogue.
Problem. Philippi doesn't have a synagogue. If Philippi doesn't have the synagogue, that means they don't have 10 Jews. In order to have a synagogue, you have to have 10 Jewish patriarchs, I think, like fathers. You have to have 10 in order to form a synagogue. So they didn't have 10. So where would you go if you were going to have a meeting on the Sabbath? You'd go down to where it's cool, like down by the river, where you'd have shade. Also, you could hear better when you speak with your next to the water. You know, there's like easier to hear if you have a little group gathering. And so it was common to go down to some place like that to have that kind of conversation. So they said, okay, well, let's go down to the water, see if there's anybody gathering there. So verse 13, on the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman named Lydia. Now, wait a minute. We said that the Acts of the Apostles is the official name of this book, right? But the name that some scholars believe would be more accurate is the Acts of the Holy Spirit. And we've talked about the people that the Holy Spirit has taken the message of Christ to. How low down are we going to go? We're going to go so low down, we're even going to talk to the women by the river. Right? If you take the path of the nobles, the Jews, the sort of Jews, the act like good Jews, but they're all men, right? We keep going down, down, down. Now we're getting down the ones that don't even have a synagogue, and they're just a bunch of women meeting by the river. We are low down. It says, one of those listening was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. Ooh. Bunch of Jewish men going to a lady's house and staying there. That's a little awkward. So Lydia is no common woman. She is a smooth talker. She's actually a very well-to-do, prominent businesswoman. Where's her husband? Who knows? Even if there was one, there may not have even been one, right? Because she's the head of her household. And she and her household are baptized. And she leverages, she says, well, you don't think I'm really a Christian, so you won't come to my house? She bats her eyes. And of course, that is not the message they want to send. They're trying to help people understand that God is coming to everyone. So that's how she convinces them to do that. Now, if you go down into your notes, if you happen to have a Bible that has study notes at the bottom, if you look down in the notes for verse 14, it says that her name may be associated with her place of origin, the Hellenistic district of Lydia. Thyatira in the Roman province of Asia was 20 miles southeast of Pergamum, and it was famous for its dyeing works, especially royal purple crimson. So it was, they manufactured it in Thyatira, and Philippi was where they exported it to the different military encampments and officers around. So she was in business and doing a booming business. And then there was this little thing here I thought you might be interested in. They said that the reason that they created this crimson was they would mash mollusks or a snail, a type of snail. They would mash to make this crimson cloth, the purple cloth to dye. That's what they said. They would mash the snails. Yeah, I don't know. Or goo, whatever goo a purple snail has, I guess. I guess it's a really bright purple, kind of a purplish red. It's a royal purple. Anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. So,
And I read that this dye was very expensive.
yes, because there was a limit to the number of purple snails you could find and mash, right? Yeah, I imagine it was. But anyway, so, and they used it for the military. It was the military or royal color. So, you had a funding source there. So she had a good business. So she's no low down woman, but from a Jewish perspective, it would be a little bit dicey there, right? Verse 16. Once when we were going to the place of prayer, notice Luke is with them now, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. Now, if you look down in your notes on that, the way that Greek is written, it would actually indicate a certain one. It's a python spirit. It was a mythical snake that was worshipped by Delphi, and it was considered a Delphic oracle. In other words, it was a spirit of a snake that this lady would use to prophesy. And it was because of this cult that was common in the area. And so it was a fortune-telling snake. And so she would speak in the voice of the snake and tell their fortunes. So she earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune-telling. This girl followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved." Now, wait a minute. What's wrong with that?
She was known to be this type of prophetess, and it was an evil spirit. So they didn't want her messing around.
Yeah, it almost makes it sound like what they're saying is a part of that pagan worship, of that snake spirit kind of a thing. Yeah. So what she's saying is not bad. It's just where it's coming from is not really the kind of reputation you want to have, right? So that's the problem with it. And then the next few words tell you the next problem. What are the next few words? She kept this up for many days. Have you ever had that happen to you? Mom, 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 mom. Right? Sometimes it's a matter of that the incessant nature of it, right? Is sometimes the problem. But yeah, it was becoming a problem. Finally Paul became so troubled that he turned around and said to the spirit, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her." And at that moment, the spirit left her. When the owners of the slave girl, now what happened if he sends out the spirit? They just lost their money-making machine, right? When the owners of the slave girl realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, These men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice. Now, this was a derogatory thing. We've read in other places that were Jewish. If you'd say these men are Jews, they'd say, oh, Jews, well, noble, right? But here in this Greek province, to say you were Jews, there's less than 10. They don't have a synagogue, so there's less than 10 even there. It was a derogatory term. And it would be like Timothy's father, who felt that circumcision was mutilation. It was that kind of thing. They were really looked down on. Verse 22, the crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten. Okay, it's bad enough to be beaten, but do you want to be beaten naked? That would be also very shameful, wouldn't it? After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. Upon receiving such orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in stocks. So they were down in the very bottom part, as far back in as they could get them, in feet in stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. And the other prisoners were listening to them. So everybody's just having a good moment there in prison. They're singing along, right? At once, suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open and everybody's chains came loose. Now that area is known for its earthquakes. They have a lot of earthquakes there. And during this time, they didn't use grout. They would cut stone and they would fit it. It was cut and fitted together. So there was nothing holding the stones on top of one another except that they were fitted together. So when this earthquake came and all the stones loosed, the walls fell down, basically. So, of course, the chains come loose from the walls, and everybody's free because the whole thing just kind of tumbles down, tumbles open and down. The jailer, the doors, when it says the doors flew open, well, the walls, crumble away, the doors fall open, the chains are loosed from the walls. It says the jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. Now, earthquakes were and are common there. So he wasn't thinking God is releasing these prisoners because they're Paul and Silas. He's just thinking, this earthquake has demolished the prison. My prisoners, who I was put in charge of to take care of under strict orders to keep in prison, are gone, certainly gone, because the walls are tumbled. So he draws his sword to take his own life. Why? He can do it later. And so he's a noble guy. He says, I was supposed to, they're going to kill me. I've lost the prisoners. I'll take care of it myself. It was kind of like a noble thing to do, the honorable thing to do. So, but Paul shouted, don't harm yourself. We're all here. The jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, sirs, what must I do to be saved?
Give me some clothes.
Yeah. They replied, believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household. Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in his house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them, washed their wounds. Then immediately he and all his family were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole family. Now this is the Philippian jailer. Sometimes you hear about the Philippian jailer. Well, the books that are written to the book that is written to the Philippians, the book of Philippians, is considered the letter of joy. It's a letter of the joy. And so it's kind of interesting. You have this joyful jailer, basically, and then you have the letter that's later written back that's full of joy. Kind of interesting. Verse 35. When it was daylight, the magistrates sent their officers to the jailer with the order, "Release those men." The jailer told him, "You can leave, go in peace." Boy, I bet that was like, phew, boy, that's great, what luck. Except he doesn't know Paul. But Paul said to the officers, "They beat us publicly without a trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. And now do they want to get rid of us quietly? No. Let them come themselves and escort us out." Paul, everybody, probably Luke and Timothy, all of them were saying, "Shh, shh, shh." Be quiet. The officers reported, speak for yourself. The officers reported this to the magistrates, and when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, they were alarmed. They came to appease them and escort them from the prison, requesting them to leave the city. After Paul and Silas came out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they met with the brothers, encouraged them. Then they left.
I'll be deciding.
We'll leave when we're ready, leave, and not before we're good and ready, right? Okay, so what would be the lessons that we can take from that for our life? From that story of what happened in Philippians?
Being a missionary with Paul would be worse than being sent to Africa.
I can see why Barnabas and Mark maybe chose their own path, right? Yeah, he would be hard. You'd have to be the right kind of person to be along with them in that. And what do you think what other lessons do we have there? What about the lesson of Lydia? What is the lesson from Lydia's perspective? From her perspective, what would be the lesson for her?
Well, that everyone, no matter what your station in life, God, Jesus came and died for you.
Even if you are a woman who deals in purple cloth made from mashed nails, and you are profitable and efficient and a leader in your business, a leader in your community, you're a leader of your own household, Christ came for you.
You can become a child of God.
And you can become a child of God. No matter how many Lydias there were, would there ever be a synagogue? No. So that's a hopeless situation, to feel like you believe in a God where you have no way to approach him, right? So she now sees that she can approach God through Christ, that there is a way. So who is too low down to be able to be a Christian?
No one.
No one's too low down. Okay, so Lydia has a real message. What about the Philippian jailer?
His household.
Him and his household. Lydia and her household. What's the deal with that? Why is it the whole household?
They probably were excited and went home and told everybody what they had experienced.
We all have like a circle of influence, right? We all have the people who we associate with that are near to us and that are influenced by us. And we also are influenced by other people. So David has been practicing his drumstick and his flute. Why? Because Eve and John have been playing their flutes and going to a flute circle. And so David went to the flute circle. And now all week I've been hearing his beautiful flute sound, and he's wanting to do this drumstick today. I'm sorry. It sounds good, but just so you know.
Okay, thank you.
He's coming loaded, ready. He's been practicing songs. He downloads music, all that. The circle of influence. The circle of influence, right? So we all have a circle of influence. So Lydia's whole household came to the knowledge of Christ. The Philippian jailer and his whole household came to the knowledge of Christ.
I think back then it was their custom that whoever the head of the household was, whatever he believed in, the whole family believed in.
But also your circle enlarges out from that.
Yes, it does. And Timothy grew up in a family where the mother was a Jewess and the father was Greek. So it wasn't like always, it wasn't always that you became whatever that was.
He was following his father's footsteps initially.
Sort of, because he wasn't circumcised, so I know.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's those lessons. Any other lessons? What about the lesson for Luke or Silas or those people with Paul and Timothy? What about them? Any lesson there? I don't know. I would say keep your distance from Paul. He tracks trouble.
No wonder Mark left.
Yeah, no wonder Mark
He knew Paul was nuts.
Yeah.
I think their growth in trust in the Lord.
Okay, they were singing at midnight in the jail, in the inner thing with their feet shackled. Naked.
Can only go up from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, were they yelling and screaming, "Let us out of here, we're Roman citizens, you can't do this to us"? They were singing a song. And the other prisoners were listening too, to the songs they were singing.
And the jailer.
And the jailer. Because the jailer's question was, how could I believe, right? It was like he knew what they were saying from the songs they were singing, right?
I'm thinking from a practical standpoint of right here, right now, if you've ever been in a manager's position or a group of positions, you've seen all these different personalities. And you thought, if I could just get rid of that person, everything would be fine. And usually they're the abrasive ones. But when you step back and listen to what they're saying, as opposed to just, sometimes they really have good things to say.
Harnessing that
Uh-huh.
in good direction.
Right, exactly.
Well, and don't you think that that God has a purpose for all of us, for each of us? And there is a purpose in Paul and how abrasive he was. There's also a place and a purpose for Barnabas, who was the encourager. And so I believe there's a place for Bob, who asked the odd questions. Or, right? There's a place for Vern's sense of humor. There's a place for each of us in all of our ways. And certainly we do have to be responsive to God's leading, because you can be too harsh. You can be cynical. You can be funny and about things you should not be funny with, right? All those things can be strengths or weaknesses. But so can being quiet and polite could be a weakness, right? There are times when we need to say, no more quiet and polite. Now we're going to take care of this thing. So it seems to me the point is that God can use all of them. And we need to allow him to use us in the way that he can use us. Be willing to do what he's called us to do. Yeah.
Paul lost his patience with the slave girl. And that's very similar to what Jesus lost his patience with the money changers at the temple. We can lose our patience and still not sin. And I think there's two examples.
Yes. That's a good point. It's a good point. Anyone else? Okay, we will start on Acts chapter 17. By the way, we have not yet gotten to the point where they believe Paul wrote any letters. Just so you know. But we've now been introduced to the people that he's going to be writing to later, because eventually he's going to write to Timothy, and we've met his mother and grandmother. This is where that happens again. He goes back, and they're still following in the way. And then also the Philippians. He'll be writing back to the Philippians. I read one commentary who thinks that Paul kind of had a thing for Lydia, because they think she was pretty and nice and be just the kind of person that he would get along with. Not that anything untoward happened there, but I mean they think that he had a special heart toward the Philippians, and that you can see it in the writing of the letter to the Philippians. If you wanted to read a fun kind of, I went back and read Philippians after I got here, just kind of read through it like a whole letter. And so if you want to go through this, we can just kind of read through it and remember these were the events that happened when he first came to Philippi with Lydia and all those people. And then when you read the letter of Philippians, kind of keep them in mind. Those are the people he's writing back to. So, okay? Okay, so we have a prayer request. Junior is in ICU. He's been there 3 days. He's in terrible condition.
He's doing really well.
Okay, so he's doing better now.
Yeah,
Okay. Junior.
my brother-in-law, my
Oh,
sister's
okay.
husband, they live in Georgia.
And he's doing better now. He was in ICU for 3 days, and he was the worst person they had in there, in the worst condition. And now he's out, so that's good. And any other prayer requests?
Kurt was at church.
He
today.
said his surgery went well.
Yeah, and they took a tube out. There was a drain tube, and now the little pads that they put on for him to heal, he's down to a little pad, so it's not hardly leaking at all.
Good. Good. Let's continue.
I went down to talk to Mary, and Ken is doing better. He has a walker, and he goes outside in their yard and walks around, and his despondent